I hope that you can all hear me before I start. Can you hear me?
We can.
Good, okay. Well, then I'm going to give you a very special greeting. Peter, thank you for the introduction. And I sometimes wonder who this person is that has done all these things. Because actually I'm just me. But I'm going to give you a special greeting that is the distance greeting of the chimpanzee, and this is short distance. So, and that simply says, this is me, this is Jane, because every chimpanzee has his or her own distinctive voice, and it helps the members of the scattered community keep in contact with each other. Well, it might seem that this is a far cry from what you all gathered to talk about today. And I spent time looking up what democracy actually means, but I think you all know that, so I'm going to skip that part. And just simply say that the days that I spent in the rainforest with the chimpanzees from 1960 to 1986 were the most amazing in my life. And it was while I was out in the rainforest that I felt this great spiritual connection with the natural world. And I began to understand the interconnectedness of all living things and how each little species, no matter how small, how insignificant it may seem, has a role to play in this magical tapestry of life that we now call biodiversity. Tapestry of life sounds ever so much nicer, or even the web of life. And we're in the midst of the sixth great extinction of plant and animal life on this planet. And it may seem that losing just one small species could make no difference, but maybe it was the main food of another species. And so this goes on, and it can have a ripple effect that can lead to ecosystem collapse. So what's this all got to do with democracy? I think it's true to say that until we can learn to live in peace and harmony with the natural world, we'll never have peace on Earth. And while people are fighting over the last resources, there can never be democracy or anything like it. I left Gombe in 1986 when, at a big conference in Chicago, I realized, because we brought chimpanzee researchers from 6 different study sites, and I realized with shock the speed with which forests were disappearing and chimpanzee numbers were declining. And so I felt that it was necessary to actually go around Africa and see for myself, because I don't think you can talk about anything in a meaningful way if you haven't had some hands-on experience. So yes, I learned what was happening to the chimpanzees, the destruction of the forest, the foreign corporations coming in to extract minerals or oil and gas, making roads, and human populations locally growing, moving further and further into the forest, the hunting of chimpanzees, shooting mothers so they could steal and sell the babies, or for bushmeat, because in some African countries, people think chimpanzee is a great delicacy. So at the same time as I was learning all this, I was learning about the dire problems faced by so many of the humans living in and around chimpanzee habitat, the crippling poverty, the lack of good health and education systems, and the degradation of the land as the human populations grew. And it came to a head when I flew over the Little Gombe National Park, and where it had been part of this great equatorial forest belt that stretched right across Africa to the west coast. By 1990, it was, oh dear, Susanna, the internet is going unstable. The internet, I've got a message saying the internet is not stable.
Brian, tell her we can hear her.
Yeah, it's okay, Jane. We can hear you. Keep going.
So you're not hearing me, is that right?
No, we are hearing you. It's fine. Go ahead.
You are hearing me.
Yes, we are. Please proceed.
So should I just carry on?
Yes, please.
Yes.
And will you interrupt me if I vanish? Because I'm getting these weird messages on the laptop.
I will interrupt you, yes.
Okay, good. Because I'd hate to go on when you couldn't hear me. So, okay, okay. So as I was saying, I was realizing the plight of these people. And when I flew over Gombe, which had been part of this great equatorial forest belt, when I flew over in 1990, that's 20 years later, it was just a tiny island of trees surrounded by completely bare hills, more people living there than the land could support, too poor to buy food from elsewhere, farmland overused and infertile. In fact, these people were struggling to survive. And this is when it hit me. If we can't find alternative ways for these people to make a living without destroying their environment, then we can't even try to save the chimpanzees. And bear with me, because all this is interrelated and linked to what you're there to discuss. So the Jane Goodall Institute began a program called Take Care or Tukari, and it was a very holistic approach to community-based conservation. And it involved sitting down with the people and asking them what they thought we could do for them, not a bunch of arrogant white people going into a poor African village and telling them what we were going to do to make their lives better. And so we began restoring fertility to the overused farmland because they wanted more food, and working with the local Tanzanian government to improve health and education in the villages, which is what they wanted. And as they came to trust us, we introduced water management programs, reforestation, microcredit opportunities based on the Grameen Bank, because Mohammed Yunus is one of my heroes. Then we began getting as much money for scholarships to keep girls in school as possible, because it's been shown all around the world that as women's education improves, family size tends to drop. And so we were empowering women, and we were helping their daughters to grow up to be responsible citizens. And in fact, the birth rate has gone down in these villages around Gombe. And so successful that we began moving further and further into other villages in the chimpanzee range, introducing this Tukari program, and everywhere we had success. And we introduced up-to-date geospatial mapping so the villagers could plan their land use management, which they're required to do. And they put land aside around Gombe so that the chimpanzees had more space, and there was a buffer between the people and the chimpanzees. And as we expanded further, then other villagers put land aside so that the chimpanzees of Gombe, who'd been completely isolated, could now move out and others could move in. And this is really successful. And all of this information is now collected by volunteers from 104 villages who go to workshops and learn how to use smartphones and go into their forests, they're very proud of this, and record the health of the forest, whether they see chimpanzees, leopards, pangolins, and so on. And this is all uploaded onto a platform in the clouds, Global Forest Watch. So successful that this program is now in 6 other African countries. And it's all based on the democratic process. It's all based on working with the villagers. And because of this, they now understand that protecting the environment is for their own future as well as protecting wildlife. Because the forests offer us what we like to call a service. They provide us with clean, fresh water and air. Well, as you all know, the sad thing on the planet today is how we, the most intellectual species that's ever walked on the planet, is destroying its only home. And the thing that makes us more different from chimpanzees and other animals than anything else is the explosive development of our intellect. I mean, just think what we've done. And I would beg all of you, it's coming up to full moon soon. Next time you look at the moon, yes, we all know that we've enabled people to walk up there, but look up there and get again that sense of awe and wonder that I felt when I first knew about the landing on the moon. And we can do that, and we can do so much more. So how come that we're polluting the land, the water, and the air? How come that we're destroying the forests that do so much for us? And the other great lung of the planet, the oceans, polluting them, and you all know about the plastic islands out there. And the runoff from agriculture today and from industrial and household waste is washed down into the rivers, polluting the rivers, and eventually ends up adding to the pollution in the ocean. A lot of pollution from these great cruise liners and so on. And so as we're doing all of this, we're recklessly burning fossil fuel, even though there are alternatives, clean, green energy, which if governments would subsidize, instead of subsidizing their old cronies in the oil and gas industry, then we could start moving towards a better world. And so the lungs of the planet, the forests and the oceans, as well as peatlands and so on, are supposed to be absorbing carbon dioxide and giving out oxygen. But what's happening now is that as we destroy the forests and pollute the oceans, they're no longer capable of doing that job. And all of this collectively has led to the greenhouse gases. Also, methane is a very lethal greenhouse gas, and that comes from the melting permafrost. It also comes from our desire to eat more and more meat, animal agriculture, animals, billions of them, all producing methane gas during digestion. And so we have got the climate crisis upon us. It's no longer something that might happen, although the climatologists warned us about it many, many, many years ago. I've stood in Greenland. I've seen ice melting and great icebergs crash into the ocean, with Inuit elders telling me even in the height of summer, the ice used not to melt. And this was late winter when I was there. I've met people who've had to leave their island homes because at high tide, they're no longer habitable, because the ocean level is rising not only from the melted ice from the polar regions and the glaciers, but also because as the water heats up, it expands. And so we truly are facing one of the greatest crises we've ever known. Don't you think that unless we can learn to live in harmony with nature, we can never truly learn to live in harmony with each other? And this is how I feel about it anyway. So Peter asked me if I would address you all today, and I felt really that wasn't really what I'm all about. But what he and I decided that I would talk about is that as I was traveling around the world, telling people about what was going on, trying to raise money for our projects, I was meeting so many young people who understandably didn't seem to have much hope for the future. And so I began talking to them. Some of them were really depressed. Some of them were really angry. Most of them were just apathetic, and they didn't seem to care what happened. And why did they feel this way? Because we have compromised their future, and there was nothing they could do about it. We have compromised their future. And we've compromised their future. And there's a saying, we haven't inherited this planet from our parents, we borrowed it from our children, but we have been stealing our children's future, not borrowing it. And it's not surprised that they're angry, depressed, and apathetic. So in 1991, I began this program, Roots and Shoots, with 12 high school students from Tanzania. They came to see me because they were concerned about different things. Some of them, why didn't the government do more to prosecute the poachers who were killing animals in their national parks? Why was the government not prosecuting the illegal dynamite fishing that was destroying the coral reefs? Why weren't more people doing something to help the homeless children out on the streets, or the beggars, the cripples? And why was there such cruel treatment of animals in the markets and the throwing of stones at stray dogs? They cared about so many things. They weren't being taught about any of this at school. It was just this group had got together and started talking about what was going wrong. So they wanted me to help. So I suggested they went back and found their friends who cared about the same sort of thing. And we had a big meeting, and from that meeting, Roots and Shoots was born. The main message: every individual matters. Every individual has a role to play, even if we don't yet know what it is. Most importantly, every individual makes an impact on the planet every single day. All of you who are listening to me and most of my friends, we can make ethical choices in what we buy, what do we eat, what we wear, where did it come from? Did it harm the environment? Did it lead to cruelty to animals? Is it cheap because of child slave labor in another country, or sweatshops and so on? We can start making ethical choices. And although it may seem not to matter much if it's just me, when it's hundreds, then thousands, then billions of people, it's going to move us towards a better kind of world. But before we can make this better kind of world, we have to do something to alleviate poverty, because when you're really poor, you've just got to do what you have to do to survive. You've got to cut down the last tree in your desperation to grow more food or make charcoal to get some money. Or you're going to fish out the last fish. You're going to buy the cheapest food in an urban area. You can't afford to ask those ethical questions. So we have to alleviate poverty on the one hand and do something about our unsustainable lifestyles on the other. And we must address a really serious problem, which most people don't want to talk about. On the planet today, there are an estimated 7.5 billion people. Already in some places, we're using up more of nature's natural resources than Mother Nature can replenish. And it's been estimated that by 2050, there will be 9.7 billion people on the planet, or something in that region. What's going to happen then? What is going to happen then? It's no wonder people get depressed. It's no wonder that democracy is crumbling. And one thing that I did read, and excuse me if I look, because this really isn't my subject, but let me see here. Yes, I discovered this when I was doing the research, that we know now that we humans are conducting ourselves and our industries and our lives in an inappropriate behavior around the globe. And it's very clear that the world is worsening in areas that have contributed to the collapse of previous societies. The climate is changing, the gap between rich and poor is widening, and our demands on the environment are outstripping planetary carrying capacity. So this all ties in, I think, with what you're talking about. So going back to Roots and Shoots and how this can make a difference to, I mean, we all know that democracies are crumbling around the world. We all know that there's this swing to the far right. We all know that police brutality is increasing, that more and more presidents in some countries are becoming dictators. We know that freedom of speech is being curtailed in many countries. We can consider ourselves lucky to be in countries that are meant to be democratic, where at least we have freedom of speech, where at least we can take part in demonstrations without being thrown into jail, where journalists can speak out against things that they see going wrong. And we must think about all those people in countries where none of this is possible. So how does Roots and Shoots help? Well, to start with, it existed only in Tanzania, but it grew from the bottom up. That's what's important about Roots and Shoots. And the young people themselves decide what they will do. And they decided, because of the interrelationship of all living things, they would do projects that benefit people, also that benefited animals, also that benefited the environment. Between them, they would tackle all these three interrelated things. And as it spread across Tanzania, where there are now some 4,000 groups, mostly young people moving into other schools because they feel so passionate about this program. And then gradually, as I was traveling around the world, it sprang up in more and more different countries. We found that art always played an important part. How amazing to see children in rural Tanzania sort of cut off, and yet they were doing little plays that talked about the damaging effect of people coming into their village from outside and wanting to cut down the trees so that they could grow crops or start mining or something like that. Little children. And through the Roots and Shoots program, they were understanding that they had some rights. Anyhow, as these other Roots and Shoots groups around the world began springing up, the United States was obviously a very important country. And I wanted to see if Roots and Shoots could grow in areas of high crime, areas of depression, where this gap between rich and poor is so keenly felt. And so starting in the Bronx, on the East Coast, and in South Central in Los Angeles on the West Coast. And yes, it worked. On the West Coast, we worked in these areas, high crime with Crips and the Bloods, and got involved with the LAPD, who said, this is the ideal program when we're trying to rehabilitate young offenders. And to see there, these young people coming together and understanding the problems and coming up with solutions and then taking action. That's the important part of Roots and Shoots, is taking action. And then in the Bronx, there was this group of mixed, they came from 5 different schools in deprived areas. And it was a mixture of white, Latino, Black students. And I watched in amazement as they performed a play where one of the students was acting as the CEO of a big company, and another little group were representatives of Roots and Shoots. And they were telling the CEO, did he realize that the styrofoam he was producing was harming the planet and harming their future? And this little play was so good that it enabled them to get rid of styrofoam from all their school lunch boxes. And then they were asked to perform it in front of the mayor of the Bronx. So you can imagine how I felt to see that this idea that grew in Tanzania far away was actually having an effect. And then we brought in some of the Ivy League schools, because obviously young people who have that privilege can make a very real difference. And we need to encourage them to make the right sort of difference. And Roots and Shoots started growing there. And it grew among the Democratic pupils and the Republican ones. They got together. They worked together. They found solutions together. They worked out what to do, and they went out together and did it. And so what I wanted to do was to read to you a couple of messages that I've had from Roots and Shoots members in different parts of the world, because we're now in some 60 countries, probably a total of about 100,000 active groups, but really difficult to tell because some groups start and then disappear. Other groups start in remote areas, and we may be lucky to even find out about them, but they're all making a difference. And so it's important to understand that in our philosophy, a Roots and Shoots group can only take action after really understanding and discussing an issue and then deciding together on the best way forward. So by choosing projects between them that benefit all three, animals, people, environment, the students are learning how everything is interconnected, and that finding a solution to one problem may actually lead to creating another problem. And so you have to think the thing through. If we do this, if we stop buying this product, what will happen to the people who are manufacturing that project in a far-off country? We need to think about alternative ways for them to live, just as we did for the people living around Gombe with our Takari project. So thinking of all the amazing luck I've had that has led to me being able to initiate this Roots and Shoots movement, which is, I'm so proud of it. I'm so proud of the young people. I'm so proud of those who are coordinating the movement. But it was just so lucky for me that when I was young, I had a mother who was so wise and who taught me so many things that I've been able to share with students. She taught me that if you meet somebody whose views are different to yours, it's no good being aggressive. First of all, listen to them. Maybe they've thought of things you haven't. And then if you still feel that you're, well, perhaps more right than they are, then you need to try and persuade them. How do you do that? Not by arguing. I've watched people of different views arguing, and as they argue, you see they stop listening to each other because they're so busy trying to refute the arguments of the other. So you have to reach into the heart. And the only way I've found to do that is to tell stories. Tell stories to make people think differently. So compassion, empathy, respect for other ways of living. Even if you don't totally agree, you can respect what other people believe to be true. And also, very important in our Roots and Shoots philosophy is the fact that every major religion around the world shares the golden rule, do to others as you would have them do to you. And that this hatred that's growing in some places of Muslims or of Jews, that's the fanatics. It's not the core of the great religions. They are not causing this hatred and bitterness which is growing around the world. It's the fanatics. That's the same in the United States with the Democrats and Republicans. I would vote Democrat. I'm not an American. But I've met so many Republicans who have just the right, according to me, the right way of tackling the problems of the world. But now it's become so divisive, just as it has in the UK. And so our children from this young age are beginning to understand, to respect, to listen, to show compassion, and to reach into the heart with stories. We try as often as possible to bring young people together from different parts of the world, and watching close friendships develop between Israelis and Palestinians has been absolutely wonderful to see, realizing that underneath the differences in the color of our skin, in the foods we eat, in our culture, our religion, underneath it all, we're human beings. And so this is the report I wanted to read you. And it comes from somebody I've known since she was 3 years old. Her name is Smita Darcy, and she's Indian by nationality, but born in Tanzania, and then moved to be with her parents into the United States. So she now teaches a primary school in New Jersey. And her group helps to raise money to send laptops over to the children in poor rural villages in Kigoma in Tanzania, where she grew up. And this has had such an amazing effect. Now, can you imagine this? An 8-year-old from a rather remote village who'd been learning on his laptop, and Smita goes out there every other year. And he came up to me and he said, in our school grounds, we're very lucky. We have an acre and there's a lot of trees there. and people had been cutting them down. But we've decided in our Roots and Shoots group, we want to protect them because we know that they help our environment and help our future. So he said, do you think if we measure the number of trees we have and the types of trees we have, will we be eligible for a Red Plus grant? 8 years old. And I'll bet you most 16-year-olds in the US don't know what a Red Plus grant is, which is a grant from Norway to help to protect forests. So it's pretty amazing. And so when she started her group, this is what she wrote. I began by asking questions to facilitate a discussion about what Roots and Shoots involved, what projects might they undertake, and the role that each individual plays in this. The children were riveted, fully engaged. They listened to each other's ideas and mine with respect. One by one, they began to state the myriad of problems they thought needed to be solved. A few among them suggested forming small groups to write a list of what might be the most important of these problems for them to solve. Off they went in clusters of 3s and 4s with a piece of paper and a pencil and started lively discussions. I listened and observed, she said. I was witnessing a small community with a sense of purpose, compassion, motivation, joy, empathy, respect, communication, all the values that we possess, whether readily accessible or waiting to be awakened. As I began to think of the next steps, one student came up to me and asked if we could reconvene everyone. To my mind, we had a leader. The ideas were many: visiting senior centers, helping whales and pangolins, planting trees and gardens that would attract pollinators, raising money for other students to enroll in after-school programs, working to eliminate pesticides and plastics. They then decided which of all these they would try to solve together and voted to achieve consensus. The process of brainstorming began on the best way for a resolution of the selected problem. All too soon, the session ended. As the children began to greet their parents who were waiting to take them home, one child said he was going to tell his mum to email all her contacts. And another said, yes, and then they can email their contacts. We have to tell our dads too, said another. They were exhilarated at the thought of so many people who were going to know about what they were doing. And so they all decided to recruit their parents to email their friends. That evening, I received countless emails from parents about the dinner time conversations and the excitement about Roots and Shoots. And every single one of those parents volunteered to help. And so, says Smita, when the project was completed, the children, the parents, extended family members, invited guests were all invited to a celebration, all connected by a Roots and Shoots club. The community gathered around a large table laden with potluck dishes. They were happy, laughing, talking about shared visions and actions with trivial matters forgotten for now. They were all stakeholders and stewards with a common goal. Imagine if all the children everywhere were part of Roots and Shoots. What would the world be like? Would it be fair, inclusive, peaceful, respectful, mindful, caring, equal, and helpful? As adults, will these children make different choices as heads of corporations, politicians, scientists, engineers, gardeners, educators, parents, zookeepers, entertainers, voters, and consumers? I think the answer is pretty self-evident. And then if you want another example of how young people can influence their parents, some of whom may be in high places, maybe politicians, decision makers, and so on. How about this from China? I was so moved when I read this letter written to me by the mother of one of the really outgoing young Chinese Roots and Shoots members who learned English in order to be able to speak to me. And her mother said, her name is Joy, the child. Her mother wrote, Joy and all her classmates in primary school founded their first Roots and Shoots group with the help of all the teachers and Chengdu Roots and Shoots office. In the following 5 years of primary school, all the little kids adhered to the Roots and Shoots spirit advocated by you. Only if we can understand can we care. Only if we care will we help. Only if we help shall all be saved. They had activities in schools, communities, and families at least once every semester. They called on people to protect water resources. They called for abolition of live bear bile. They performed a play to raise money for the injured bears. They sold pictures drawn by themselves to raise money for animal protection. They used their power to affect more adults to make those small but essential changes, especially on people's mindset. It is no exaggeration to say that most of us adults would never have got to care for the environment without these children. And we might still have the numb lifestyle, caring nothing about the planet but ourselves. Our children used a bright way to let us have a different view of our life so that we may reconsider our responsibility in this society. In this way, more and more adults are willing to bring about changes to the neighborhood with public spirit. I'm telling the story of Joy and her friends to show the importance of roots and shoots. This program, all of those wonderful changes would never have taken place without roots and shoots. As a mother myself, I started my own change from accepting passively to accommodating actively after my child brought back all the information from roots and shoots. I went from a mother who only cared about herself to being more willing to be part of the activities related to social responsibility and helping children to be more responsible. I went from a consumer who was quite selfish to learning to cut down unnecessary buyings. Also, I started my own action with many other parents who were also affected by their children and wanted to make a difference.